And that's why we rush this. It's like, what can you do to act in the next few days to help make this happen? This is an opportunity. This is historic. I am super excited to give everyone this opportunity to be part of this. And we could be voting on this bill in the next few days, and you could make a big difference. So with that said, we're going to say this a few times. We'll say it in the beginning. We'll probably say it in the end, and I'll probably put some things in the chat in the middle. Here are the three things. They're easy greasy things to do. When is anything easy? But this is, but so important. And the first thing is everybody needs, if you have a member of Congress who's Democratic, give them a call. Easy. It doesn't even take a minute. And I'm going to put a link in there that CCL has a tool. They tell you exactly what to say. You don't have to make anything up unless you want to. They give you the phone number by putting your address in there. They'll tell you who to call, and go ahead and make that call right now if you want to, but just make the call. You only have to do it once. You don't have to do it multiple times. Now, here's the thing. Why you just said, Laura, that Citizens Climate Lobby is nonpartisan. Why are you saying call your Democratic member of Congress? And there's a couple of reasons that really go to the core and our core values of why we do that. Number one, this has to be done quickly. This is a mount. Carrie Ritzler told me a couple of days ago, we're climbing a mountain. We're climbing Mount Everest, basically, to deal with the climate challenge, which is like the biggest challenge humanity, some of us think, that has ever had. Okay, so we're doing this challenge, and basically what this bill, what this law has provisions for is some tools. We can put some hiking boots on our feet to start climbing Mount Everest. And once we have those hiking boots on, we absolutely have to work across the board in our bipartisan way and have great relationships. It's not going to be feasible for the Republicans right now to vote for this bill. So I would rather everyone spend your energy calling your Democratic member of Congress, and also tell your friends to do that. And if they're in a different state, your family, your acquaintances, tell everybody you know to do that. And if you have extra time, instead of calling your Republican member of Congress, who really is going to have a really difficult time voting for this, call a friend or somebody else to vote for their Democratic. Next bill we work on, and not everything everybody's completely now. Even though it's a great bill, there's some compromises that went on, and therefore there's going to be chatter like, oh, I don't know if I like this bill. And we want the chatter to be, the din to be so loud that we want this bill to go through, that these other chatter of, well, I don't like this piece and I don't want to like that piece, very light as compared to what we are going to do. So that's the reason that we want a lot of calls and need your help. Okay, that said, let's go to the man, Nathan Iyer. He is a senior associate with RMI and the U.S. program in Washington, D.C. He's expert in climate and energy policy. He's also a big climate advocate. When he was an undergrad at Vanderbilt, he headed out 100% Vandy, I think, by 2020. He led that movement there. He went into Duke. He studied science and society. He studied energy policy, and also set up evidence-based policy sorts of seminars. And he's been working on this bill really hard for the last few months. And like I said, we talked Friday. He was able to do it in a very understandable way for me. And I said, you've got to do this for everybody. And so he's going to share with you what he's doing, what he knows about the bill. and maybe some nuts and bolts. I'm going to watch the chat. And so put your questions in the chat, and we'll spend about 10-15 minutes for that at the end. And then I'll stay on as long as you want, but if you need to get going, I understand that. So that said, Nathan, do you want to share your screen?
Absolutely. I'm going to start with a basic introduction before I jump into the presentation, but thank you for that brilliant introduction. It's an introduction that only a mother could do, I would say. So hey all, my name is Nathan Iyer, and like Laura said, I've been working on this bill for the past 2 years. I essentially left her home and went to DC to fight out the largest climate bill that we have ever seen in the United States. And what has come out of Congress these past couple of days is just that, the largest climate investment in US history. Now, this bill does way more than climate. It's obviously called the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's a reflection of a compromise and of optimizing for a lot of different problems that lawmakers in Congress have been grappling with, not just for the past 2 years, but for many decades. And so this represents a culmination of those efforts. Now, on Wednesday, everyone was feeling pretty glum, I'm going to be honest. We had heard about 2 weeks ago that Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia was stepping away from negotiations on this climate bill and was focusing his effort on a pared down piece of legislation for healthcare costs and for drug costs and deficit reduction overall. He cited inflation as a key concern. We have been working on this energy package for super long. We reached out to all of our allies in Congress, senator offices, key staffers who had pulled multiple all-nighters putting this together. Every single advocacy group we could think of, from the big greens to the big organizations and advocacy orgs pushing, and everyone said the same thing. This is dead. This is without a pulse. We reached out to Senator Manchin's office and they said the same thing. And so everyone went on vacation, essentially. Everyone was like, well, we really did try. The deadline is passed. And so my boss right now is fly fishing in Idaho, and he barely knows the news. The same goes for a lot of advocacy orgs across the world and in the United States. And so when I talked to some of my friends who were staffers, they said this was the single best kept secret in Washington of our lifetime. The deal that was struck between Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Schumer was the best kept secret we have ever seen, not a peep from some of even Schumer's own top aides. So when I say this is a twist, I really mean it. Right now, my boss is in France right now on probably a boat cruise, wishing that she was back in the office right now. So it's been a wild week, and the moment we saw that announcement, we all got online and essentially haven't stopped being online since then. So talk about a roller coaster. But what is in this bill includes a lot of different provisions, and I look forward to kind of walking you through them and also walking through the drama that went into fighting for these provisions and all of the different factors that were being considered when we put this bill together. It is an impressive piece of legislation, and yeah, I'm so excited to share this with you. So I'm going to share my screen and let's get started. So introducing the Inflation Reduction Act. Mom, can you see my screen? Give me a check. Awesome. So this is a landmark opportunity. Landmark means game changing in every way imaginable to reduce prices, especially energy prices, rebuild American manufacturing in these new clean energy technologies, and to fight the crisis that is climate change. Now, there has been a lot of headlines recently because the US is facing a lot of crises. That fiery hellscape that you see in the bottom left is actually California last year. And in DC, you could actually see smoke blotting out the sun from wildfires from across the nation. Currently, inflation figures are as high as they've ever been in the last 40 years. Russia has invaded the West for the first time in decades, doing an all-out assault on Ukraine and threatening the rest of Europe and the NATO alliance. And healthcare costs are through the roof, making it very challenging for citizens to get prescription drug prices and to afford just basic healthcare across the board. And this is also coming off of a COVID pandemic that killed hundreds and thousands, if not, I believe, over 1 million now, of US citizens and millions more across the world, which also disrupted our supply chains. So we are facing many crises simultaneously, which has led to Congress trying to find ways to solve this problem. Over time, lots of different proposals have been written and proposed, and all of them have been optimized for a point in time that quickly gets engulfed by a new crisis. And inflation is the one that really caused the previous bill to die. Inflation has been higher, I believe it's over 9%, and it's really hitting Americans hard. And one of the core drivers of that inflation is energy prices. Energy prices from the invasion of Russia, one of the largest oil and gas exporters in the world. A crisis because the COVID pandemic led to negative oil prices, which caused havoc among energy producers in the United States and abroad, and just a lack of production in the United States and worldwide, and the need for investment to invest in more production across the board is the primary driver of this piece of legislation. So what is this Inflation Reduction Act? It just dropped, it's new, and it's 700 plus pages. So it starts with an energy package, and this is an energy investment package primarily. So it includes $370 billion for energy and climate change. And we'll dig in a lot more into what's in that package. It includes all sectors of the economy and all sources of clean energy, as well as some leasing reform and some additional oil and gas incentives to increase the overall energy production in the United States. And we could talk about that at the end. But overall, analysis from our organization, from other independent think tanks, from Princeton University, and from energy policy modelers, as well as from individual analysis from Senator Schumer's office, has demonstrated that this bill will reduce emissions by 40% compared to 2005 levels by 2030. Our overall goal is 50%. So what this does is it puts the United States within a stone's throw of the overall climate goals that they have set as part of the International Paris Agreement. That is a big deal. So when you hear about trade-offs, when you hear about, well, we're giving up this or we're compromising on that, that 40% number is rock solid. And it represents almost 1 billion tons of CO2 emissions per year by 2030. That's game changing. In addition, there are measures on prescription drug reform, allowing the government to negotiate drug costs, especially older drugs that have been essentially ramped up to maximize their profits from the government, as well as insurance subsidies to make sure that insurance prices don't pop up dramatically in the next year. And there's also deficit reducing measures. So there's some tax loopholes that are being closed, as well as the drug reform that's leading to a reduction in the cost to the government balance sheet, which essentially reduces the overall deficit by around $300 billion over the next 10 years. And that's kind of one of the driving inflation reduction measures. So raising more money than we're spending in order to kind of drive down the national deficit. So those three pieces kind of make up the core of this legislation. But what we are talking about today is that energy component, because it includes truly game-changing provisions that will dramatically accelerate our ability to drive down emissions in the United States. And I'm super excited about this. This is Christmas time for energy analysts. And when you say things like securitization or transmission production tax credits, it doesn't mean much for the average person. But for folks like me who have been in this deeply for the last 2 years, it represents probably some of the most exciting opportunities and the most efficient ways to drive down emissions rapidly across the economy. So I am maximally excited about this legislation. So let's dive into kind of what sort of lenses the drafters were thinking about when they put together these puzzle pieces. The first is inflation. That's the namesake. How can energy investments save money on energy costs? Well, if you increase supply overall, especially for hyper cheap clean energy like wind and solar, you can actually reduce folks' energy bills dramatically. In addition, investing in things like electric vehicles and electric heating and hyper efficient sources of energy use can reduce energy costs both for households and for businesses pretty dramatically. So that's the first piece. This reduces energy costs by investing in a broad range of energy sources. The second, like I mentioned earlier, is climate, and invest in clean energy sources. The third is really exciting, and I have a lot to share on this one, but this is manufacturing. So how can we make sure that the technologies that create clean energy are built in the United States instead of abroad? We've had trouble with manufacturing in the United States, sent a lot of jobs away from our nation. And so this is a powerful bill to bring those back, to make sure we're capturing that value of building a new energy economy. There's also a communities component. So really focusing on communities that will be most affected by a transition away from fossil fuels, as well as targeting communities that really struggle with energy costs. So they have a bunch of provisions within each tax credit to say, hey, if you are really struggling, you're going to get more of this energy tax burden credit on your household energy bills. So it really is targeting the people who need it the most, so that we're not just throwing money away. And the final one is security. And we're going to talk a lot more about this, especially due to the fact that Russia is using their might in energy in order, as a weapon, in order to essentially cow additional sanctions from Europe, and to essentially inflict a lot of pain on our European allies. So how can we reduce our oil addiction so that, you know, a random move by a Saudi dictator doesn't impact gas prices for Americans? And also to ensure that the United States has control over our energy needs without having to bend the knee to some foreign dictator. So all 5 of those pieces are being optimized, and there's lots of transitions that prioritize one over the other. So you're going to see things that may not be optimized for climate, but might be optimized for inflation or for security. So keep those 5 in mind as we walk through some specific provisions that are super exciting, that have obviously a lot of drama associated with them. So we're going to start with this clean electricity component. So essentially, this is an idea that was come up with by the senator of Oregon and actually the Republican senator in Alaska. For the past 10, 15 years, the way that we've incentivized clean energy is we've given 2 or 3 years of tax credits for wind and solar, and that's it, essentially. And every 2-3 years, the industry waits and they say, am I going to get more of this credit? And maybe they do, and maybe they don't. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in that field, and they're always wondering, okay, is this going to get extended or not? And that kind of prevents these folks from thinking long term. You're not going to make massive investments if you're not sure that you're going to be in the money in 2-3 years. So they did a couple of things in order to fix this. The first thing that they did was they said, okay, this is 10 years. We are going to invest for 10 years with these tax credits. You don't have to worry about it. It's going to be there. You have policy certainty. So if you want to invest in these big expansions of your business, you can do that. So that 10-year piece is a big component here. The second thing they did, which I think was one of the most clever pieces, was they said, we're not going to pretend to know which technology is going to be best for which use case. Instead, we're going to provide a credit for whoever can create clean electricity. It could be wind, it could be solar, it could be nuclear, it could be geothermal. There's a lot of energy below our feet that can be tapped with new drilling technology. It could be tidal, it could be hydrogen, it could be a ton of different things. So they're saying everyone qualifies. You make clean electricity, you get a credit. That levels the playing field. And that was an innovation by a Republican. So again, this is a bipartisan concept. And it also cuts red tape and silly rules. Like, for example, co-ops, municipalities, they can't take advantage of the old credits because of some weird tax rules. So they really looked at who is not able to take advantage of the old stuff and how can we make this as efficient as possible. And what that means is that everyone can play in this game. Everyone can take advantage. If you build clean, you get the money. And so overall, our analysis has demonstrated that this massive reshaping and streamlining of these clean energy tax credits, again, every technology in the book that is clean will qualify. It translates immediately to savings in American households. Our analysis shows at least $5 billion just from this provision alone to American households. That's about in 2 years, and that increases exponentially as the bill goes on. And so those immediate savings are because essentially clean electricity is super cheap. It's a lot cheaper to slap a solar panel on the ground and just sit there and absorb the sun's rays than it is to mine coal and constantly burn it and maintain these massive plants. So we are seeing immediate cost savings for Americans, and these credits really accelerate that process. So this investing in clean electricity piece is the cornerstone to the entire bill. The second piece is one that I worked on extensively. And this is a real battle between security for the United States and climate, accelerating our transition to clean energy as fast as possible, and how manufacturing, and in particular, Georgian senators, saved the day. So let's start by this chart. What this chart is showing is all of the steps that it takes to create an electric vehicle battery. And what you see is that a massive amount of midstream refining and creating these core pieces of the battery are created in China. So if you want an EV, there's an 80% chance that the materials are refined in China. Now, there was a huge battle between the Midwestern senators and the senator from West Virginia on this topic. Essentially, they wanted to provide tax credits for electric vehicles, reduce oil consumption, save consumers money, that sort of thing, in order to expand EV adoption in the United States. But Senator Manchin said, right now, we are dependent on China. We're not creating our own supply chains. We don't have them secured. And so we would be building our entire $1.3 trillion auto manufacturing facilities on Chinese production and refining. And that's a real risk. That's a huge chunk of our economy. And to be dependent on the Chinese for that is a risk. And he looked at Russia, who was cutting off Europe from their key energy supplies. And he was looking at China as well, who had cut off Japan from refining when there was a small dispute about a fishing boat a couple of years back. And he's saying, how can we depend on Chinese production to create these batteries and allow for this hyper cheap commuting? Because it's a foundation of sand. We're not securing our battery production, and therefore it creates a real risk for us. And the EV folks said, you know what, we have to accelerate vehicle electrification. And so at the end of the day, they came up with a compromise. How can we be secure in producing these electric vehicle batteries while also accelerating the adoption of these EV batteries when we have no supply chains in the United States? And so they did two things. The first is they said, you only get the credit if these battery materials come mostly from the United States and our allies. Now that's going to hurt the EV tax credit pretty dramatically because as you can see, most of it comes from China. But it also did something very, very interesting. It said for the creation of batteries and battery refining, and also wind and solar, and a bunch of other key technologies, this tax credit says if you produce it in the United States, this tax credit is just going to cover the cost between producing it in the United States and producing it in China. And what that does is it says, hey, if you want to build in the US, you're not going to sacrifice anything economically. You can build in the United States for the same price as we do in China. And that was a concept that came up because Senator Ossoff and Warnock wanted to incentivize solar manufacturing in the state of Georgia. And they saw a bunch of these solar manufacturers. They knew that just 10 years earlier, China had flooded the market with solar panels to kill off US competitors. And they said, how can we protect these new burgeoning factories to allow for the United States to be in control of its own destiny? And they took that same idea and they translated it into batteries. And what that did was convinced Senator Manchin that, you know what, we are going to build EVs in the United States. We are going to build out our supply chains, and we're going to accelerate electrification at the same time. So this is a real life example of how our concern about the security of Americans' access to materials and our real desire to drive climate came into conflict, and how they overcame that particular conflict. So that was something that I worked on a lot. I worked on the battery provision, and that was something that literally had never seen the light of day until it landed into that bill. And it was a result of long, hard hours behind the scenes to try to find a solution to this almost intractable problem. So that was really cool. And you can find it in the bill on around page 435. if you're interested. And then finally, this is another piece that I'm super excited about, investing in the building blocks of the future for clean industry. So all of the technologies that we've discussed so far exist right now, are pretty competitive, and just need to be accelerated. But there's also a huge chunk of the economy that needs new tech. It needs things like clean hydrogen. It needs the ability to capture carbon from the atmosphere. It needs like new sources of energy that are extremely powerful and extremely dense, like next generation nuclear and advanced geothermal, in order to make that next step and decarbonize that next part of the economy. Now, right now, the biggest barrier has been cost. If you want to do a new thing and it's more expensive, how are you going to cover the cost? And the simple answer is we just didn't. We said, oh, this clean hydrogen would be really neat, but we can't afford it. It's, $1 more expensive, $2 more expensive. So it's not going to happen. And what this does is it says, actually, we're going to cover the cost for the next 10 years so you can scale up these technologies. And as you get bigger and more advanced, those costs are going to come down. And by the end of the 10 years, we can remove the incentives and have a truly competitive at scale industry to give us the building blocks we need to do things like create, for example, clean hydrogen, which could be used in fertilizers, which are key for agricultural sector, which can be used in shipping, which can be used in planes, which can be used in heavy trucks. It really solves the last mile of the climate problem, and it needs to be ready to go and ready to scale in the next 10 years. And so this says, you know what, let's not wait 10 years. Let's play ball today. Let's build out these hubs and these manufacturing today. And so one project that I worked on is how this clean hydrogen credit that is in the bill that makes clean hydrogen competitive can actually solve the global food crisis. One thing that folks don't know is right now we're living in the worst food security crisis since World War II. A lot of the crises like COVID and the Russian crisis and the cost crisis and the supply chain crisis has led to massive disruptions in our food system abroad, which is mainly made with natural gas. But clean hydrogen can be replaced, can replace natural gas to allow for the production of fertilizer, which is absolutely critical to feed the world. So this is one example of how a new energy technology can actually provide security for a whole nother sector for food. So these are exciting new techs that now will have real legs and will be able to scale very quickly. So that's new jobs, new innovation, new billion-dollar companies, and new industries for states to take advantage of. It's very exciting. Hello? Can you hear me? Oh,
We can hear you now.
We can hear you.
could you not hear me the entire time?
You were muted for about 20 seconds.
Okay, perfect. So this final anecdote is one that happened really recently. And so this is a quick story about how the Russian invasion led to a hyper-efficient program to reduce emissions in buildings. Currently, Russia is using natural gas as a weapon against our European allies. They're restricting natural gas, which will lead to massive shortages in Europe, which will halt industry, which will make it harder to heat homes, which will stop gas turbines from providing electricity. And they're using this as a massive threat. And so Europe depends on the United States to fill the gap as they kind of move forward. And so one way that we can export more natural gas is to reduce our own consumption. And the way we can do that is instead of using natural gas in the homes, we use something called a heat pump. And a heat pump essentially takes heat from the outside and transfers it inside. It's about 3 times more efficient than natural gas on an energy basis. And so this conservative from Ohio came up with this idea where he realized that one of the big issues with getting people to install heat pumps is that essentially no one thinks about how they heat their homes. They're like, my home is hot when I put up the thermometer, but I have no real idea how that system works. And switching from a boiler to a heat pump is really a lot of pain. And the only time that people ever think about it is when their old system breaks. And so his great innovation was like, okay, here's an idea. Everyone has ACs too. You could actually just make those heat pumps. An AC makes your house cold. A heat pump essentially reverses an AC and makes your house hot. And so if you put a very special credit on ACs to just cover the cost, make them all heat pumps, you can actually just dramatically reduce the need for natural gas to heat buildings. So it was a very targeted, like you had to know exactly how people interacted with these technologies and how to change technologies very slightly in order to remove emissions. And for a couple $1 billion, they were able to reduce emissions and save money about 5 times that amount. So there's a bunch of these little programs in the bill. They're, again, like candy for folks like me, where these very clever designs developed over years and years and years were developed, refined, and included to solve small problems that otherwise most people won't even think of. And so this is just one example of how an energy shock across the world led to a super interesting program being included into this bill. And it will obviously be very impactful to everyone who is considering changing from gas to electricity in their homes and their businesses. So I threw a lot at you, so I'm going to only make a couple more points. At its very core, this means that we have hit an economic tipping point in the transition. For so long, people have said, in order to fight climate change, we all need to make sacrifices. We need to tighten our belt buckles and pay more for energy and pay more for cleanup. It's been an uphill game, and we've been pushing this boulder up, and it's only by the goodwill of people who care that we've made progress. But what this bill has done is said, actually, the solutions to this climate crisis, the solutions are now cheaper than the old fossil systems, which means that deploying them will save you money, will save your company money, will save your town money, will save your state money, and will ultimately save your nation money. That means that the strategy now is to move as quickly as possible. You don't have to twist anyone's arm, because the faster that they move, the more money they will have in their pocket. And that is a tipping point. That is a game changer. It means we can move a lot faster. And that's what this bill does. And so now all we have to do is deploy as quickly and as efficiently as we can. And so this means we have to ask more of our leaders. With these investments, accelerating the transition means opportunity for yourself and your community. In your house, you can invest in an electric vehicle with these new tax credits, and there'll be incentives to change to clean electricity, which will save you money on your electricity bills. You'll also just save your money on your bills in general, which they're investments to electric fleets, to add solar, to invest in renewable alternatives and efficient technologies will save those institutions money. The bottom line is these technologies will save these institutions money. And your city and your community, the more that your city can do in order to attract developers and investors to build these solutions, the more money your city will have overall. Because again, this saves money and it also attracts jobs to your communities. And ultimately, we're going to need large manufacturers and large industrial hubs in order to take advantage of these new investments. And so your state is really responsible for attracting, like in Georgia, those big battery facilities, those big EV facilities, those big manufacturing facilities. That huge economic opportunity requires leadership on the state level to take advantage. So again, the faster we move, the more money stays in our pocket. And that's what this bill represents. It represents a tipping point. It represents a change in the level of ambition we can expect for our leaders. And it represents real hope that we can take climate change down in a rapid pace, while ensuring that the United States stays stable and reliable for the rest of the world. So that's all I got. I'm sure you all have questions, but I'm happy to answer them.
Nathan, shall I read out a few of the questions that you have?
Please do.
Okay. This is by Dan May. Does the bill provide for ways to finance acquisition of heat pumps by people who can't afford the upfront price?
Oh, sorry. So the bill does a number of things that support this. So the main tipping point right now is that heat pumps are more expensive in some cases than gas boilers. So it provides, I believe, a $2,000 tax credit in order to cover the costs between the gas boiler and the heat pump. Now, this doesn't mean that you'll rip out a brand new boiler and do it today. But if you have a choice between both, it does provide that incentive. In addition, it provides the incentive to update your electrical paneling. That's been a huge bottleneck in the past. Like you need to pump more electricity, and that requires an upgrade in your house's grid. So it actually overcomes that bottleneck as well by providing an incentive to ensure that your house can actually handle this new electricity load. So yes.
Hey, Nathan, can you take your presentation down and then we'll show everyone? And if there's any other questions, they can.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's see, Jocelyn asks, what energy provisions will be especially and obviously attractive to individual Georgians or Georgian families? Heat pumps, energy tax credits, anything else?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I couldn't hear you.
Maybe I'll let Jeff. Jeff, do you want to go ahead and
Yeah, I was just curious, as far as individual Georgia families go, what is going to be obviously attractive to them? You know, if we're trying to sell it locally, what are they going to be excited about?
Great question. So there's a number of different provisions. The clean energy tax plan will immediately reduce costs for utilities. So Southern Company has a huge incentive to invest in these very cheap solar plants primarily and retire their coal, which is extremely expensive in comparison. There's also provisions to help retire that coal plant in a very cheap way, so that that massive asset isn't on their balance sheet. So overall, just reduces energy bills and like the cost that they'll pay to the utility. In addition, the incentives both to electric vehicles will have another tipping point where the amount you're paying for electricity to get your vehicle to and from work is dramatically lower than the gas prices that we're facing right now. And it'll make sure that those EVs are cheaper than the gas-powered alternatives. There's several others, including investments in communities that allow for cities and municipalities to build clean energy on, say, landfills in order to kind of retrofit those old industrial facilities and make them productive again. And finally, there's a huge amount of investment that Georgia in particular can take advantage of for our huge solar facilities, for our Rivian facility, for the battery facilities planned in the state. So those big manufacturing facilities are going to bring jobs and investment to their local community. And that's just off the top of my head. There's a ton of other ones like efficiency for their home, investment to make sure that they can, weatherize and provide more protection from heat waves, and many more.
Let's see, Henry, you had a couple of questions there. Do you want to go ahead and ask him?
Only if I can find them again.
You had one about how important is the authority for DOE to make the extra $250 billion in loans?
Yeah, because we heard that from on a Citizens Climate Lobby call. That would be tremendous.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the LPO, the Loans Program Office, is the program that brought us Tesla and a number of other massive clean energy organizations in the United States. The way that they do that is they essentially look at projects like that are a little bit riskier, that mainstream Goldman Sachs and the big banks aren't quite ready to invest in at large scales. Those big manufacturing facilities for new technologies are pretty risky for your average banker who can be actually fairly conservative. And so what the DOE Loans Program Office does is it takes fees from these folks and requires repayment, but takes the entirety of the Department of Energy's experts to say, actually, is this loan worthwhile? Is this technology real? And can we get repayment? And so giving them that $250 billion, it's actually $5 billion levered up to $250 billion. So the Treasury is only facing that original $5, but they're creating a large portfolio of these investments so that technologies that are sort of ready to get to the next level to commercialize at scale can build out their first, second, third factory. So that means that we're going to see a rapid increase in getting from these innovations from the pilot stage to the mass deployment stage. That's a huge driver of innovation. And so it's extremely important. We'll see it for battery manufacturing. We'll see it for all of the technologies that you can imagine, especially the ones that need a little bit of a low interest loan to get started.
Kyle, did you have some questions?
Yeah, I had a question related to the EV tax credit.
Sure.
Specifically just, if I understand correctly, the EV tax credit does stipulate a cost on the vehicle, like whether it's a, sedan or a truck, and if it's above that cost, the tax credit won't apply. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I think from what I saw, it was sedans like were 50K or something like that, and trucks, I believe, were 80K. Now, I think most of these EV vehicles are not below 50K today. I don't know if that's, I may be wrong about that, but that's from what I recall.
There's certainly some higher end vehicles that are, again, more expensive. So you can imagine your Tesla Model S, or your fancy one with the slide out doors, or the brand new model that comes out from, say, a BMW being above 50 grand. That being said, there are plenty of vehicle models in both categories that are well below the price. So we're saying that we're providing incentives not for luxury vehicles for someone with a lot of wealth, but for vehicles that are most likely to be taken advantage of by average Americans who just need a car to get to work. And so I think the idea was let's scope it down to technologies that your average American middle class household and lower class household will be able to take advantage of, rather than kind of incentivizing someone's fun vehicle. Although of course there are some more heavy duty vehicles that are required for work, and so that does represent a barrier for some use cases. But for most Americans, there will be plenty of models below each of those price thresholds.
Nathan and Vernon, do you have your question?
Yes, I had two questions actually. First one, I know there's a provision for a green bank. Is this different than the loan program you were talking about?
It's very different. Yes.
Yes,
So
how does that green bank work then?
So the green bank primarily works to, so let me take a step back. There's currently 21 plus green banks in the United States. They're primarily created by states. And so what they do is they go and they try to finance smaller projects. It could be a small developer. It could be, a bunch of, schools that want to finance a heat pump. And so it looks for projects that particularly need, some level of commercial banking. So it's not like scaling a huge manufacturing innovative program. It's saying like, this particular municipality needs 100 heat pumps. Who's going to provide financing? And typically, if it has additional, green qualities to it, this bank will step up. It still requires a rate of return, but it's a lot less aggressive than like private financing. So it doesn't need that same rate of return. In other words, it doesn't need as much money from you in order to loan this money. So it gives you more competitive rates, and it acts more like a nonprofit than a for-profit entity to make sure that these projects can continue. So the financing piece can be pretty complicated to differentiate them all, but this is a well-vetted model that's worked, again, for 21 states that's now being brought to the national level so all states can take advantage of a green bank.
My second question, and I'm sure you can't answer this, is what about Kristen Sinema? Do we have any feel for her take on this? Got to have her support.
Yeah, that's a great point. The ink hasn't dried on this yet, which is why our support and our voice matters a lot. In terms of Senator Sinema, no one knows what she thinks or why she does what she does. So we're all crossing our fingers, but for the most part, a lot of her concerns have been addressed by this bill, but there are some wild cards, absolutely. So we're crossing our fingers, but there's not too much we can control with her. So we're just going to carry on and try to build momentum.
Justin, did you have a question?
Yes, actually I do. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentation. I was just sort of concerned about how you're kind of coming up with some of the numbers in terms of the EVs are cheaper. Is that on like a tax credit basis? Because I've had a lot of conversations with people that are electrical engineers and sort of work in that field. And I've heard a lot. I've heard a lot in terms of maintenance costs, as well as opportunity costs, and other things financially and economically speaking that would say that they actually aren't cheaper. So if you could just get into kind of how you formulate that argument and some of the tenets that you were using, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, I believe the cost gap between electric vehicles and an equivalent gas vehicle is approximately covered by that $7,500 current EV tax credit. So we're seeing a delta, a difference of $7,500 for a lot of models if you can get battery prices down to $100 per kilowatt hour. So let me try to formulate this best possible. We're not comparing apples to apples. And again, the car with a fancy, screen is not going to be comparable to the car that's just the very basic model. But overall, what Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which has data on practically every EV model in the globe, has found is that once you hit $100 per kilowatt hour, and that's a unit of battery, you achieve price parity for equivalent models of vehicles. And so this bill includes a direct incentive for creating lower kilowatt hour batteries, for putting them together into the module, and for the overall vehicle, such that the vehicles in the United States, which on average are about $135 per kilowatt hour, hit that $100 per kilowatt hour amount. And so this gets really wonky really quickly, but the price of the battery is the core challenge here for electric vehicles. In terms of maintenance, it depends on your manufacturer. You can imagine that some car companies are better at making these batteries than others, and for others, there's certainly a learning curve. But we can imagine that over time, those kinks are going to be worked out. And there's some arguments to say that because of the less moving pieces in an electric vehicle, they don't require all the pistons and the firing. It's actually superior technology in terms of maintenance because you require less, tuning and oil checks and that sort of thing.
So how do we? What's the best way to sort of discuss this? If you're trying to make an argument in your favor, and some kind of hit you with some of the facts, as I just did, do you really kind of discuss more like the tax credits, or do you just say that it's once we get like lithium ion batteries a little lower, get a better technology, that's where we're really seeing that these things are more economically efficient? How would you approach that?
Yeah, so I would stick with the lithium ion technology. If you look at any chart, lithium ion technologies per battery was $1,000 per kilowatt hour 10 years ago. Today, it's $135 per kilowatt hour. We have every reason to believe that it will keep driving lower, even despite all the supply chain concerns, to that key $100 per kilowatt hour metric. And once we hit that tipping point, that $100 per kilowatt hour, which this bill essentially does by adding incentives today, then if you're at a lot and you're looking at two cars, one EV and one gas vehicle, the EV one and the gas are going to be about the same price. And the moment you start driving that EV, because electricity is much cheaper and much more efficient to drive cars than gasoline, about 90% efficiency versus 30% efficiency, you're saving money for every mile you drive off the lot.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
One more, we probably have time for one more question, and then I'm going to let Carrie close us out. And I'm happy to stay on as long as, I don't know what you got going on, Nathan, but we can stay on longer, but I want to kind of close it, and then I'll stay until the last person leaves. But one other question, Jeff had one about the complaints. Okay, so I was talking about the chatter. I think this might be one of the things or complaints about oil and gas leases. Can you say why these are reasonable trade-off?
Absolutely. So the oil and gas leases, as you can imagine, are a huge complaint from Senator Manchin. He's been very frustrated with sort of the permitting problems with a lot of these pipelines and leases, not just with the Biden administration, but in general. There's a lot of red tape going on. And so in order for us to permit renewable energy on public lands, he's also requiring some substantial leases on public lands a lot. And so some people are calling this a poison pill, but the reality is you have to weigh the pros and cons. So there's a couple pieces that make this less bad. And those two pieces are, number one, the leasing agreement that the United States gets for each of these oil and gas leases becomes a lot better. So we're essentially requiring a lot more money for remediation. We're getting a lot more money in public coffers for every lease sold. And we're requiring more investment on the back end to essentially clean up the mess they put together. In addition, there is a provision in the bill on a methane fee, which essentially says if you're then that was given up. That was a compromise. And I know a lot of communities are upset, but when you add up the other 390 billion in investments across the board, reducing gas consumption in cars, reducing oil and gas consumption in refineries because of the hydrogen, reducing and increasing efficiency in all sorts of ways, shapes, or forms, and then supercharging the renewable replacements, those add up to far, far more, up to a 10x more impact to reduce emissions than those leases, which don't represent necessarily projects, but opportunities for projects do in the back end. So it's not perfect and it's not a move in the correct direction, but it's solving a different problem, and it is vastly outweighed by the good in this bill, which is, again, historic.
Nathan, thank you. See, he was the secret weapon. I had to have everybody else hear this. Carrie, do you have any, and then we'll stay on, but Carrie, I want to officially close it, and then again, we can stay on longer if you like.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura, for organizing this, and Nathan for the expertise and sharing all that information with us. And thanks everyone for coming on. I just want to say a quick word. I recognize a whole lot of names on here and faces. And I recognize a lot of you from the work that you've done as a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby or other organizations pushing for clean energy and climate legislation. And if you are one of those who, like me, has been working for federal climate legislation for years and years and years, this is what we were working for. It might not be exactly the bill that you thought you were going to see, or exactly the bill language that you wanted. That's not very common, but what we've got is legislation that can bend the curve on emissions and start the transition in a real way, in a way that we need. So I just, it is not set yet. The vote has not been made. And you can imagine that there are a lot of interests that will push back against this bill. And so I think that after Senator Manchin initially closed the door on this, seemingly closed the door on this a couple of weeks ago, some people turned away from it, but some people did not, and continued to advocate, continued to call, continued to write. You had Senate staffers staging sit-ins in Senator Schumer's office, begging him to restart negotiations, and that's because there is no more time to start this process now. This is the time to do it. It's 2022. It is time to be real about this, where we are with the climate crisis and where we need to be. So this legislation has come at exactly the right time, and you are the right people today to continue pushing for it. So I urge you to call your congressman tomorrow, call their offices. If you live in Georgia, you can thank them for all of the advocacy that they've done, and for all the work they've put in, and for all of their support. Both the congressmen in Georgia, both the senators in Georgia, Senators Warnock and Ossoff, are champions for clean energy. And so you can thank them for that and tell their staff how much you appreciate it and how much you want to see this bill passed. And what you're doing then is just continuing to strengthen them in urging their colleagues to vote for this bill. And the last thing I want to say is my birthday is next Friday, and all I want is $369 billion in clean energy investment. So that's all. It's like one, I'm only asking for one thing this year, and all of you can help. So, pick up the phone tomorrow and give a call. I think, Laura, you can just go ahead and share the CCL link. I could find the other link that I had. Yeah, go for it. And also, congratulate yourself if you have been working on this, if you've been going to DC, if you've been in lobby meetings for years and years and years, writing your congressman when it felt like maybe you were talking to a brick wall. This is the result. We raised our voices, we stayed persistent, and now we are closer than ever to getting the legislation we need. And we just have to stick with it until it gets across the finish line. So thank you all. Thanks for being on the call.
Thank you. And this concludes the official meeting, but we'll hang out. And thank you also to everyone from out of state. This is all over the country. I see people. I mean, this has been great. Please pass it on. Please call, and pass this on to others. And we're just going to be very loud about this. Not time to be shy. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. This was great. Thank you, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
I'll email the recording to Laura so she can share it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Very
Laura.
informative. Very
Thank you.
informative.